Takigawa, in the humid months after the typhoon season. Takigawa had once been a corridor of commuters and old tea houses, a town of tile roofs and narrow alleys lined with bonsai and vending machines. For decades it had slept beneath the shadow of a chemical plant at the edge of town, a gray complex that hummed and spat steam like a sleeping beast. The plant employed generations, provided scholarships for the schools, and paid for the banners at summer festivals. It also buried things in the wet ground. Ikeda Kaito came home the autumn the green fog began. He had been in Tokyo, studying environmental engineering and promising himself he wouldn't spend the rest of his life in Takigawa. But his father had called, voice trembling, breaking, and said only, "Come back. Something is wrong." Kaito's train rumbled through the hills and into a landscape he had not seen since childhood. Terraced paddies like sheets of black glass. The river that had once run clear, now threaded with oily film. The town smelled faintly of iron and rot. On his first night back at the family house, Kaito found his mother staring out into the fog from the kitchen window, her tea gone cold. Her hands were clenched around the cup, as if the porcelain might anchor her. "They say the plant is burying sludge," she whispered when he asked. "They say they found strange fish in the drain." Daichi said. She trailed off. Daichi was Kaito's younger brother, who worked nights at a convenience store and had a habit of laughing too loud at nothing. Kaito listened and tried to keep his voice level. He had learned the language of reports and measurements well enough to know how easy it was to mistake correlation for causation, to let numbers shape fear. Still, he had seen enough in his studies to fear what perpetual unchecked waste could do. The first monster Kaito saw was near the canal behind the school. He had been idly following a rumor, myth-tracing, his university supervisor would have called it, when a shape slid from the water and into the weed-choked bank. At first, it was only a patch of green, a grotesque combination of bird and eel, a long, slick neck like a heron's, but the skin mottled and translucent, scales glinting like broken bottle glass. Its head ended in a mouth too wide, filled with needle teeth that hummed when it breathed. Barnacles and bits of nylon fishing line clung to its shoulders. When it noticed him, it made a sound like someone dragging a rake across a metal plate. The sound shocked the night into silence. Kaito wanted to run, but his feet were heavy with disbelief. The creature lifted itself in an awkward, half-amphibious gait and slopped off into the paddy, leaving prints of webbed claws in the mud that smelled faintly of diesel. By morning the paddy was empty, except for the ragged tracks and a scattering of silver eggs half buried in the irrigation ditch, glassy, opalescent orbs that pulsed faintly. The farmers found them and smashed them with hoes, but the smashed shells wept a viscous, fluorescent slime that crawled into the earth like ink into paper. The town's first official denials came slow. The plant's press office sent out the usual reassurances about closed systems and safe disposal. An environmental NGO published footage shot by a drone, blurry, too high to resolve teeth or eyes, and a university lab in Nagoya analyzed a sample of sludge and found traces of mutagenic compounds used in polymer production. The local hospital reported an uptick in sudden, unexplained infections, skin ulcerations with a greenish tinge, small lesions that crawled with maggots. People stopped swimming in the river. Families covered their bathwater intake with sacks and boiled the water until it tasted like metal. It happened on a Sunday. A rolling blackout, they said at first. Transformers tripped as the town strained under air conditioning and an open summer. One by one, the power vanished like a swallowed breath. The vending machines died like tombstones. On the main street, lanterns in the izakaya guttered and went out, leaving faces lit by cell phone glow and the cold, passing clouds of fog. At the edge of town, near the plant, something else woke with the dark. The creatures multiplied. They were never peaceful. The first cluster moved with the slow deliberation of predators learning their reach. Their bodies were an impossible pastiche. Shells of crustacean fused to the sagging torsos of feral dogs, elongated ribs like cages, limbs that ended in barbed, chitinous paddles. Some had the segmented bodies of insects, others loops of muscle that suggested the detritus of discarded plastic had grown teeth. Their eyes, where they had eyes, were milky and faceted, seeing in a spectrum that was not human. A few could move like children, upright on two legs, with hands that had grown thumbs too many. They learned the town the way a virus learns a host. Takigawa's first night of real terror was inside the temple yard, where for 100 years the Oban lanterns had floated for the ancestors. The temple custodians had tied knots to secure the lanterns. A group of elderly residents huddled under the eaves, whispering sutras to pray the fog away. When the creatures arrived, they glided over the stone steps like a tide. One creature uncoiled from a drainage culvert, its skin stitched with netting and metal, then simply stood and listened. Two old women screamed when their prayer beads fell silent, and the creature keened back with a sound that made the wooden beams vibrate. It was not eating at first, it was learning rhythm, the sound of a heart, the cadence of breath. The priests tried to fight. They brought incense, sutras, and ropes blessed by hand. The ropes caught for a moment as if they would hold the creature, but its flesh had the tensile resilience of rubber and the force of a tide. It broke free and dragged one of the priests into the stone lanterns, which fell and shattered like a clamshell. The eyes of the creatures found the living with a mechanical focus. They began to multiply and coordinate. One would knock down a shutter. Another would slip into a house through the broken window and leave a slimed, blackened imprint where a woman's sleeping body had been. Her neighbor found her face altered, like a mask of seaweed, her tongue elongated and splayed like a slug. Kaito moved through the days like a man in a dream. He began to document, at first for the sake of records, measurements, photos, samples. But soon documentation became a way to keep his hands steady, while his mind tried to make sense of the impossible. He discovered a pattern in the chaos. The creatures favored wet places, drainage ditches, septic fields, the sludgy bed of the canal. They also favored what was broken, what leaked. If a home had a long-standing roof leak, creatures nested in the rafters. If a shell midden had once sat near the paddy, a thing crawled there at night and devoured the bones. Children were the exceptions who drew a different sort of hunger. A few creatures exhibited a slow, tragic mimicry. The head of a woman, hair threaded with algae, eyebrow leaning like a child's lullaby. The town police tried to enforce curfews, but townspeople were stubborn in denial. A cluster of college kids broke into the plant one moonless night, driven by a mix of bravado and the voyeuristic hunger that thrives in closed towns. They filmed themselves pushing through a corridor dripping with chemical slime and found a room lined with vats, each marked with coordinates and an innocuous name. Compound X-23, Stabilizing Agent 4. Their footage ended in static and a scream. Later, a body was found outside the plant, a rib cage picked clean and filled with green moss. The students were never seen again. Their video cameras reappeared months later, washed up on a mudflat half an hour from town. The thumbnails saved the last frames, a creature leaning in close, a broken lens reflecting a face grown translucent, a small pair of hands reaching out as if to touch a camera. As the weeks passed, the fog grew thicker. It came in sheets that clotted the streets and tasted faintly of battery acid. It made the hair stand on the back of Kaito's neck. Night became longer. Even day carried the tired, listless light of those labs where powers that were once bound, sleep now conspired. A new horror arrived in the form of humans changed. Not all mutations were monstrous in the outward sense. Some were subtle. Elderly men whose speech became a series of clicks. Children whose skin developed a pale, leaf-like webbing between their fingers. They did not become animals so much as become carriers of a new language, bodies reconfigured to hosts. They whispered of the river, as if it spoke in return. One morning, Kaito found Daichi at the riverbank, staring into the water like a man dazed. His hand was raw where he had scratched at something beneath the skin. Kaito's relief at seeing his brother dissolved when Daichi turned and looked at him with eyes that were the wrong color. Faintly phosphorescent, rimmed with the green of pond scum. "Kai," Daichi said, and the voice was his, but threaded now with a rasp like dried reeds. "You shouldn't have come back." Kaito tried to take his hand, but Daichi recoiled with a spasm. He had seen the scars other towns had left on survivors' faces, split lips, fingers missing from hooks, and he was afraid. Afraid he might be infected. Afraid he might bring whatever clung to his brother across their threshold. The tests were inconclusive. Blood samples contained proteins that resembled a virus, but the genome was a chaotic mosaic of viral sequences, marine toxins, and something that suggested gene editing. The chemicals registered the presence of enzymes not typically found in terrestrial organisms. Kaito was a scientist, trained to separate the objective from the human. He knew fundamentally that explanation alone would not rescue a town from its fear. He knew that people's stories, the way an old woman swore she had seen her grandson crawl on all fours and hum, were as important as data. Stories shaped actions. Actions shaped survival. That winter the fog thickened until it became an atmosphere. It crept into lungs. People who inhaled too deeply at markets began to cough like dry leaves. A wave of madness washed through Takigawa. A teacher who slit his wrists in the schoolyard. A line of cars left by the road as if their owners had vanished, and new graffiti carved into doors with trembling hands. The government finally designated the area a quarantine zone and sent in specialists with white suits and clipped phrases. They called them specialists, but most of them looked like city men who had seen a crisis in a textbook and wanted the certification. They fenced off streets with razor wire, placed signage, and published clinical advisories about avoiding contact with the fog. The plant executives issued a bland joint statement and promised full cooperation. Families like Kaito's were invited to a temporary shelter beyond the checkpoint, where the humidity smelled of bleach. People flowed out like migrating birds, carrying what few things they could. Kaito refused to leave. His parents were old, the house was full of ghosts. He had a compulsion he could not explain, a need to record, to document, to witness. He took his camera and walking stick, and at night he walked the perimeter. In the dark he began to notice patterns of movement. The creatures were not mindless. They gathered in thickets of reeds near the old drainage fields and conversed in low harmonic frequencies that made the hairs on his forearm vibrate. The sounds had a structure like song. Within the harmonies, Kaito swore he heard an echo of human voices, mother callings, lullaby fragments, overlaid and twisted by something older. He found the first hybrid on a moonless night in January, perched on the rooftop of an abandoned 7-story building across the river. The hybrid was the size of a man, but its skin had the sheen of pebbled glass. It had hands, too many fingers, each joint ringed with cartilage. But its face was the most disturbing. It wore a mask of his mother's features, unnaturally smooth and stitched at the jaw. The eyes, though, were not his mother's. They were compound, and when it turned its head to look at him, Kaito felt the weight of a dozen gazes. The hybrid sang a note, and the city responded. Somewhere a dog howled, and a drain grate shuddered. Kaito learned, slowly, that the hybrids were experiments of assimilation. They did not merely consume flesh, they read memory. The plant sludge contained not only mutagenic compounds, but fragments of biological matter that carried patterns, the way a petal folded, the particular timbre of a voice. The creatures used these patterns like templates. They grafted parts on one another, recombining the living with debris and waste. There was a sick intelligence there. To wear a familiar face, to mimic a neighbor's gait, to lull a town into trust. Where they could not create a perfect copy, they created a suggestion, an uncanny mimicry that made the mind fill in the missing details, and betrayal follow. A turning point came when the old folks' home at the edge of town was overrun. The facility had been constructed with pride, concrete walls, a small garden, but its rooms had the damp smell of institutional neglect. A nurse described that night later, a shadow in the hallway, then the sound of wet scraping. The residents, in their beds, began to sing in unison, a low dirge. The staff found the doors jammed, and when they forced one open, a sight that no protocol could govern. The residents had been arranged in a circle, hands linked, and their eyes had been replaced with oyster shells and polished stones. They were not killed, they were integrated, smiles stitched into skin like overripe fruit, small green shoots growing from the knuckles. Kaito stood in the doorway and vomited. Reports that circulated after were unreadable to civilians. The teams sent in with gas masks returned with faces empty of expression and hands that trembled. They called their reports containment failed, and then protocol revision, and then code black. The military erected temporary camps with fluorescent lighting that swam in the fog like ghostly sails. They tried to burn the fields, to salt them. Fires turned green and sulphurous, and instead of smoke, there rose a vapor that smelled like chlorinated sea. There were moments when something very like hope emerged, a trench dug deep and treated with lime, a chemical that cut growth. A group of volunteers trapped a small pack and detonated charges, and for a few nights the town breathed like a living thing, less encumbered. But hope is porous. One ingenious scientist discovered that the plant's waste had leached into the groundwater and altered the microbiome of the soil. Microorganisms that had once broken down cellulose had gained new genes that enabled them to bind and amplify foreign proteins. The result was a kind of biological amplifier. A small mutation could, in the right wet conditions, cascade into larger morphological changes. The town, with its paddy fields, its fecund wetlands, its long history of recycling, compost, refuse, fish carcasses, was a breeding ground. What had once been domesticated water and waste became a crucible for an emergent ecology. The hybrids learned too. They began to develop strategies for infiltration that were terrifyingly effective because they were so intimate. They dug under foundations and lay in wait for the sound of a small child crying. They mimicked the voice of a mother from the other side of a wall. They learned the precise rhythm of tea kettles and the pitch of harvest festivals. They adapted their scent to match shampoo and fabric softener. They knew that trust is a chemical reaction and that scent opens doors. Kaito fought back like an animal defending territory. He fashioned deterrents, bells that shrieked at high frequency, reflective surfaces that confused compound eyes. He boarded up the windows with the kind of ruthless carpentry you learn when you need to seal a house from the wind. He and a handful of townspeople formed night watches, lighting fires in pots and stamping through the rice paddies. They wired systems of thermosensors linked to bike horns to warn of movement at the borders. They could hold the line for a while, but not forever. The monsters' change in strategy was swift and psychological. They began to show themselves inside the town's dreams. There were reports of children waking with hands full of slime shells, of elders dreaming of being fish and waking with gills sprouting from their ribs. Dreams bled into waking life. People reported hearing music from the river, old festival songs, slowed down and played backwards. A girl on a hill called out that she saw the town from above, and that the houses had been rearranged like teeth. The sensation of being observed became unbearable. It was as if the creatures were no longer a threat from the outside, but had learned to anchor themselves within the minds of the living. Then the festival came. the autumn matsuri that the town could not cancel, no matter how broken it was. The banners were tattered, the taiko drums sounded duller, and more people stayed away than attended. But those who came did so with stubborn defiance. The shrine was crowded with lit lanterns like a pale constellation. Kaito and his mother walked among the stalls, hands tucked into sleeves of damp kimonos. For a brief shining hour the town remembered itself. Children chased sparklers, a vendor sold warm taiyaki, and the old priest performed the purification rites with a voice so steady it made Kaito's chest ache. The creatures came as a slow wave. They infiltrated the festival, not with the smash of a riot, but with gentleness. One by one, the music was replaced by a subtle harmonic, two notes that did not resolve, and Kaito realized it was the same tone he had heard by the canal. It vibrated in the bones. People began to feel an urge to step toward the river, as if pulled by a string. Some did not resist. Kaito watched as a young couple embraced, then separated with tears, and walked, hand in hand, toward the river mouth. A child slipped into the water and did not scream. People's faces softened, the way meat relaxes beneath a wetting. Panic bloomed. In the stampede that followed, lanterns were crushed, stalls overturned, and the priest's robes were stained with mud. The crowd surged toward bridges where the fog lay thick. Kaito reached for his brother, who had been standing near the tea stall, and found him smiling, in that terrible borrowed way. Before Kaito could pull him back, Daichi let himself go. Hands moved to push him forward. Several townspeople grabbed the boy, and with the clinical efficiency of a funeral, carried him and their own toward the river like people carrying offerings. They stepped in and turned, willingly, their mouths opening to breathe the fog. Kaito tried to stop them. He tried to cut a throat with a kitchen knife. He was knocked aside by a pair of arms that were his neighbors, lulled by the songs of the hybrids. He woke on the bank with his shirt soaked in mud and salt, his body trembling like a struck insect. The river had taken most of them. The bodies that washed ashore the next morning were not easy to identify. Their flesh had become translucences, the skin etched with small intricate patterns, like lace. Small plantlets had sprouted from ears and eye sockets. In the mouths of some of the dead, Kaito found tiny shells. Inside a cracked skull he found a green fruit, one of the glassy eggs, pulsing faintly. After the river took its offerings, the hybrids changed once more. The fog withdrew in little eddies and puddles, and where it receded, the land did not go back to the same green as before. It turned a strange, almost brilliant shade. The weeds grew in precise spirals, the reeds formed concentric circles, and the rice paddies sprouted tall stalks whose grains were shaped like beads of glass. People noticed that the crops around the paddy edges grew faster, larger, with a sheen like wet enamel. They tasted strange and sweet, with a tang of metal and the sea. Some saw salvation in that abundance. Farmers reported richer yields, and a few residents argued for embracing the new crops. They brought samples to the shelter officers and the scientists, and when small mammals fed on the produce, their fur grew iridescent, and they developed a placid demeanor. The produce could be sold, and money could be made. Faced with ruin, a seed of pragmatism sprouted. A group of desperate villagers called the hybrids blessings. Kaito could not accept such a bargain with mutation. He saw the way the hybrids made the town exchange its past for a glossy synthetic appropriation. He saw the way his neighbor's smile had changed, the mouth not quite the same. He watched pairs of lovers lie together beneath translucent stalks and imagine themselves at ease. He thought of his father's hands, calloused, rough with work, and how they had taken decades to form, and he could not bear them rewoven into something else. He left the shelter one night, with 3 other men from the old watch. Their plan was simple and furious. They would go to the plant and set charges, seal the vats, and cut the town free from the root of the mutation. They drove into the night, with lanterns and shouted prayers. The plant at night is a monstrous diorama of lights and conveyor shadows. It smelled of oil and lemon cleaners. They climbed. The security doors yielded with a soft moan, and then the alarms woke like Arctic birds. Floodlights blinked through the fog. The men split and ran along corridors that reeked of metal and old jokes. Kaido's chest was a drum. At the vats, they found not only polymer sludge, but animals and plants submerged in a viscous medium. They found cages full of creatures, half-formed hybrids, and labels in neat typeface, like an artist's inventory. An old lab notebook lay open, pages smudged with what might have been tears. The scientists who had worked here had written plain sentences about adaptive assimilation and ecological rebalancing. Someone had typed, with bureaucratic clarity, to replenish and stabilize the coastal microbiome by introducing engineered gene amplifiers. Testing region, Takigawa. Secondary hypothesis, potential for cross-kingdom integration. Kaido understood in a cold, clean flash. This had not been an accident. There had been an experiment, but the experiment had grown teethed and moved beyond the control of men who thought in spreadsheets. The plant had been trying to fix a coastline, a way of thinking both arrogant and patronizing, to engineer nature without nature's humility. They had attempted to teach a river to heal, and it had taken teachers of its own. They lit the charges.